But now we have Keith Grainger, who's a committee member, and I hope most of you know how highly regarded he is for his technical knowledge about wine. He writes about it, he educates, and he's a consultant winemaker. And his latest book, has just been published, is Wine Faults and Flaws, and it's a practical guide. So we will hear some of that today. An earlier book, Wine Production and Quality, co-authored with Hazelnut, who's in the audience today, won the Gourmand Award for Best Wine Book in the World for Professionals in 25 years. So that's something spectacular, and it's recommended for many wine courses. He's got a high technical knowledge. He's a consultant winemaker in Cyprus, Turkey, and South Africa. He travels extensively when he can, and he regularly works in China presenting wine masterclasses. He was also one of the founders of the Association of Wine Educators. He's been a member of the Circle for a good time on the committee, and was our treasurer, keeping our finances in good order until Sumi took over. So over to you, Keith.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to have such a large turnout. So I'm just trying to see if my system is working well today. So let me just go into speaker view and see if I can see myself. Oh, there, rather in good luck. Okay, and my chat box seems to be working. Hopefully the screen share will very shortly. For those who aren't muted, can you please mute yourself? Get a little bit of feedback, thank you. So a very quick overview today, a lightning tour of Wine Faults and Flaws. And let me get the plug-in straight away for my new book, Wine Faults and Flaws, A Practical Guide. It's published by Wiley, should be available, I think, everywhere in the world, if not now, certainly within the next 10 days or so. Available on Amazon, obviously. And a very good website, by the way, for people in Britain is Hive, which actually supports small bookshops, and their discounts are often greater than Amazon. I will be putting up a discount code at the end of the presentation, though, for anyone who wants to buy direct from the producer. So I shall try and immediately go into screen share, and if someone can tell me if the screen share is working. Share, and let's bring up the slideshow. Right, do we have a full screen, everybody?
Yes.
Good, that's absolutely brilliant. So this is a lightning tour today, and the new book is 528 pages. I'll say straight away, there's quite a few pages of references and a reasonably comprehensive index, so there's not all text. So in the course of 45 minutes or so, we can only have a quick glance at some faults. So what I thought we'd do is look at some of the more important ones, but also some of the lesser known. My aim in the book is to try and bridge a chasm. And the chasm is between the scientific wine books, which we writers tend not to dwell too long on, though perhaps we ought to, and what I call the readable books. And of course, the scientists don't really look at the readable books very much, because they think they're full of anecdotes and lacking in rigor, albeit, of course, they express the art of wine in a way in which the scientific books can't do. And I'm going to say straight away, we're looking at faults in a very technical way, but to my mind, some of the very best wines in the world for a small producer are actually made by artisans, I would say, rather than people who've done an enology course. Perhaps we could acquaint it to music or to art. So hopefully I'll bridge that gap and we have a book that is readable. So we're going to start off with a basic question, is that are wine faults on the rise or in decline? And you'll see I've given the answer yes and yes. It is very hard to get figures because obviously the industry doesn't want to say too much about faults in wine. But to my mind, faults are declining are the haloanisole taints, and I'm going to call that, just for 1 second, a cork taint, although we ought not to. So haloanisole taints due to contaminated corks are definitely in decline. Oxidation in the form of chemical oxidation, I'll talk a bit more about that later, is also in decline, particularly at so-called entry-level wines, the ones that used to be sealed with injection molded closures, the Supreme cork, which I think we all know was particularly ineffective as a closure from an oxygen ingress point of view. Also in decline, I'll say, is excess sulfur dioxide, in so much as you can actually smell that burnt, struck match, etc. Having said that, I was at a tasting a couple of days ago in London. I've actually been let out and off my leash a little bit at a Roussillon wine tasting, and there actually were 2 wines out of 60 which had a distinct whiff of excess sulfur dioxide. And just while mentioning that, there was one poor winery, and there were 5 wines I tasted, and all 5 were faulty with different faults. So that does show that wine faults are very much with us still. Faults that are increasing include, come back to haloanisole taints, the same thing that gives cork taint, but due to environmental factors. Talk a little bit about that later. Brett faults, Brettanomyces, are increasing in many regions, but I must say they are reducing in others. So in Australia, for example, you're much less likely to find a Brett wine now, but some other regions, certainly you are more likely. But we'll glance at why. Mycotoxin faults are on the increase, and I say fault, some people wouldn't call mycotoxins a fault. I do, and we'll see why in a second. Smoke taint very much on the increase in New World countries, and it is not unknown in Europe as well. Reduced aromas, to my mind, are on the increase, but once again, we have a boundary as to when reduced aromas are or aren't a fault. Atypical aging, I'm going to talk about in just a second, and also heat damage, particularly heat damage in transport. So why are some faults increasing? Start off with the matter of many must now have higher pH and lower acidity than was once the case. And we can certainly point a big finger at climate change, which obviously there's little we can do about as far as each harvest is concerned, but delay in harvest to achieve so-called phenolic ripeness. I say delay in harvest because in fact people are actually harvesting earlier in the year, but still very often they're waiting until they've got those wonderful brown seeds and they think that the tannins are going to be delightfully soft. And of course, the more we delay, the higher the pH. And then consumers are perceived to want, and perhaps they do want, this is arguable, that softer style of wine. And I'm sure Nick can vouch for this, you know, quite often standing by the supermarket shelf and someone's asking the wine advisor or shelf stacker, you know, is this a smooth, soft, red, etc. You know, so certainly something that is easier to drink. There has, in the last 20 years, been a gradual increase, and I don't see this abating much at the moment, in the levels of residual sugar in many brands and so-called entry-level wines. I say so-called because I think a lot of people never move from entry-level, so it's not a term which I particularly like. But in many, particularly New World Chardonnays, you'll find more than 5 grams and sometimes even 10 grams or so of residual sugar. I always remember talking to Wolf Blass, and he says, Keith, you've got to remember to sell your vine in the United Kingdom. You must do 2 things. You label it dry and make it medium. And, you know, once again, what consumers are perceived to want. There's been a reduction in the levels of free and particularly molecular sulfur dioxide. Obviously, everyone's trying to reduce sulfur dioxide for health reasons, and obviously legislation comes into play. But also there is the fact that if you reduce sulfur dioxide, once again, you are bringing out the fruitiness. And zero added sulfur wines are beyond the scope of today's presentation. But you often find, you taste them, they're very young, they're so incredibly full of primary fruit. And part of that is that it doesn't reveal itself with low sulfur dioxide. Bringing wines to market early can give all sorts of problems. You know, a producer might want their new season Sauvignon Blanc on the market straight away. Someone is cutting across me at the moment, not quite sure who. Could you put on mute, please? but that can give problems because wine naturally stabilizes with time, and obviously lots of the stabilization processes take time and money. Bottling white wines and rosé wines, I should say, they're in clear glass, is giving a big increase in the fault of light strike, sparkling wines as well as that. And this is purely anecdotal, but I personally have noted an increase in, I'm not going to say as much faults as flaws, in wines which are bottled at destination rather than at source. Now, there are many good reasons for bottling at destination, and then obviously from an environmental perspective, that can be a very good reason. But I'm just going to give a simple fact that if you bottle at destination, you're going to need to adjust the wine twice, once before it leaves the winery and again at bottling time. And that is additional handling operations, which gives opportunities. I'm not saying this happens in all cases, certainly doesn't, but the things like oxygen pickup, etc., and other spoilage taking place. Now, we have lots of challenges when discussing the wine faults and matters of definitions, boundaries in particular. Look at when is a fault, concentrations of the compounds responsible. Obviously, the sensitivity of individual tasters, but I'm not going to go into that too much. The actual matrices of individual wines, what is a fault in one wine will probably not be in another. Good example, for example, we look at high volatile acidity, high VA. In Italian wine, it can be nice and piquant and have a little balsamic note, etc. And you were to put it in the Burgundy, and oh my God, what is this? Culture. We look at some things, for example, let us go to Brett. Europeans generally are somewhat more tolerant of Brett than people are in New World, and particularly in USA. And then, of course, fashion comes into it as well. And I've got the quote there from the first edition of Burgundy by Anthony Hansen of "Great Burgundy smells of shit." Now, Anthony was a Burgundy expert, Burgundy lover, but back in the early 90s, 80s, he believed that that Bretty farmyard horseshit nose was what Burgundy was all about. And by the time he's doing his second edition, he realised that that wasn't necessarily the case. But what I'm saying is that fashion certainly comes into play. So I'm going to start off by looking at one fault, or is it a fault at all? And that is TDN. Now, TDN gives this kerosene, paraffin, Riesling, petrol nose, which people associate, particularly with mature Riesling. Isn't just Riesling. And so the aromas develop in bottle, and you'll see the full name of the compound up there, and I shan't tongue-tie myself by filling it out today. Particularly noticeable in wines from warm climates or hot vintages, and where there's a lot of sunlight exposure, and is due to enzymatic or acid catalyzed reactions. Climate change has resulted in elevated TDN definitely in recent years, and they seem to be appearing, compounds appearing earlier in bottle. Can be mitigated in the blurb, and so I'll try and say how do we avoid faults by appropriate canopy management. And some of the things that were popular till a few years ago, such as removing leaf on the eastern side of the vine, perhaps isn't a good idea from a TDN perspective. But this is a classic example. When is it a fault? When is it not a fault? People often like a little bit of that petrol, that kerosene in the mature Riesling, until it becomes overwhelming, of course. And I equate it, and do the same with Brett, of watching a comedy with a risque comedian. They're extremely funny. Then suddenly you cross a line and, oh my God, this is unbearable. This is now obscene. And I think TDN is one of those. And you can't always just measure the actual concentration of the compound. Again, it's how it relates to the wine in question. What is interesting, in fact, is with the move to screw cap, excuse me, that was a unfortunate mispronunciation, screw cap closures, that TDN is probably becoming more prevalent because it is absorbed by cork in bottle. And Nick, in fact, one of the Waitrose, when you were with them, in fact, Pegasus Bay Riesling often showed quite overt TDN after quite a few years. And I always felt that would have been the bottle, which actually would have been better sealed with a natural cork. So that's my first fault or not. Let us move on. Tartrates, here's a fairly easy one. Do tartrates, excuse me, come back one slide. Do tartrate crystals represent a fault? Many consumers' eyes, yes, and indeed in many producers' eyes, yes as well, actually. I would say not, generally speaking. The illustration on the slide there is from the bottle of Riosec. You often get tartrate crystals in, you can. Normally potassium bitartrate, but can be calcium tartrate. So if consumers can be persuaded to accept them in a bottle and not think that it's a broken glass or something else, that would be good. Because the methods used for stabilization of the wine, so if they don't manifest themselves, really detract from quality. And a good example, cold stabilization. Cold stabilization is, if it's undertaken, is the biggest source of oxygen uptake in wines. Wines absorb far more oxygen at those low temperatures. Ion exchange, and particularly electrodialysis, that doesn't have the same problem, but there is a feeling that electrodialysis, once again, does detract from wine. And the additive methods for not having tartrates, metatartaric acid is sometimes used, except for after a year or two, you get even more tartrates. And the other things you'll see listed there also have an organoleptic impact. So are tartrate crystals a fault? To my mind, I say no, they're not, but we cannot persuade many consumers that they're not, and even many producers. Let's look at an under the radar fault, atypical aging, where wines are rapidly losing their varietal character and start to become very thin, often confused with premature oxidation. And you'll see a quote here from Mr. Henrik Kling, one of the most serious quality problems in winemaking. Nearly all wine producing countries and up to 20% of German wines may be affected, up to 20% of USA wines as well, which occurs on account of hormonal stress and hydric stress in vines, largely due to a compound 2-AAP, you see on the slide there, and normally will manifest itself after the first sulfurization of the wines. Wines will taste very dull, very flat. And since I've studied this and looked at a lot of research, I realized looking back at old taste notes that a great many wines that I felt were just either poor wine or perhaps were prematurely oxidized were in fact suffering from ATA. I opened a bottle of white Bordeaux 2018 vintage just a couple of days ago, showed all the classic signs of atypical aging. One of the things that can be a telltale sign is a waxiness and a nose of naphthalene mothballs. So atypical aging, no one really talks about very much, but is well and truly with us. Only affects white wines, must say straight away. Right, faults are increasing, blame it on the customer. And we'll see a quote here from my friend Jackie Backer and Ronald Clark. Result of change in consumer preference and increase in off flavors, for example, volatile ethyl phenols metabolized by Brettanomyces. It's very easy, isn't it, for us? We're trying to give what the customer wants. It saddens me a little bit sometimes that wine has become globalized, standardized, all that great diversity of hard as nail tannic wines, wines with acidity through the roof aren't there anymore, because to me they were often part of identity. I remember as when I first got into drinking wine, going into Augustus Barnett, it would have been at the time, this whole array of bottles. They looked so exciting, you wanted to touch them, you wanted to smell them, you wanted to take them home. And when you took them home, of course, lots of them weren't great wines, but they were very individual wines. Lots of them did show faults, certainly. But what I'm trying to say is that they weren't samey wines. And I think one of the things that's led to an increase in some faults is this move to soft, brown, easy drinking wine. Once again, when is a fault a fault? Let's come back again. What I'm going to say, a fault is a compound in the wrong concentration, in the wrong wine, in the wrong place, and at the wrong time. Reductive aromas will be a classic example there. 1 minute they're a fault, and you taste the wine 2 years later, and it is absolutely beautiful. Although having said that, some compounds are always a fault if they're present in wine at above trace elements. Let's glance at some things which we don't normally consider to be faults, which really are looking at biogenic amines, including histamine and cadaverine. Cadaverine you can actually taste, it's one of the ones which you can. It gives a blood-like aroma, but as we see can cause all sorts of problems. Aqua Toxin A is very much on the increase. It comes from the great skins and flesh. It's a possible carcinogen. Ethyl carbamate is a probable carcinogen. Comes from the degradation of arginine, the amino acid. And what is also a problem sometimes is phthalates, a word that's almost impossible to pronounce. Phthalates are hormone disruptors in humans. Normally means the wines had somewhat extended contact with a polymer, a plastic material, including small plastic holding tanks, that can come sometimes even from passage through hoses, etc. When Pascal Chateauneuf did some analysis some years ago, he found that 58% of the French wines he had analysed had above acceptable levels of phthalates. We're going to hear a lot more about these four in future years. I touch upon it in the book, but for some better research on biogenic amines, and it's a free to do paper. You can see the one at the bottom left-hand side of the slide there. Right, in the food industry generally, we distinguish between faults and taints. And some people do in the wine industry as well. And we look at a taint is an unwanted, unacceptable odor or flavour derived from an external source. And production equipment, as mentioned in tanks, additives, tartaric acid, processing aids such as bentonite, even the atmosphere in the winery, transport containers and packing materials, including quartz, can be the sources of taint. Then faults, we would normally say, something that is an internal chemically or microbiologically produced off flavour or off taste, or perhaps the result of product deterioration. And oxidation would be a classic example, and volatile sulfur compounds another. But distinguishing between those in wines, to my mind, makes little sense. So TCA we can refer to as a taint, yes. But TCA at low levels, you cannot smell or taste. But it's certainly impacting on wine quality, stripping out the fruitiness. So can we really call it a taint? Many people refer to horsewet taint, including some of the great researchers on the topic, the taints from some of the Brett compounds, reductive taint, but those are really internally produced. So to my mind, although we'll often use the word taint, anything that is wrong in wine is a fault, or if it's in a lesser proportion, a flaw. Now, one of the challenges, of course, is what are the thresholds at which we can smell or taste these. We can distinguish between smells and taste, the odour detection, the taste detection thresholds. But then we know that something is wrong, but we might not know quite what it is if it's above threshold, which will vary according to the wine matrix. Do we recognise what it is? So you can have a sniff and say, yes, this is TCA, another anisole, this is so-called cork taint. So we can have a threshold for recognising that, which again will vary according to the wine. And then have a rejection threshold to say, yeah, this is there, and we will send the wine back, it is undrinkable, etc. And we're increasing in levels of the compound as we go down this slide. And then with some of the compounds, we have to look at the odor activity value, which isn't just down to the presence at which we can detect it, but how much does it influence on the aroma or the taste. We can put faults into three basic groups, microbiological, chemical and physical. That isn't always that easy either. Physical is quite easy. I mean, bits of glass in a wine or something is pretty obvious something's wrong. Indeed, I see there's been a recall just in the last week on that. That is something that affects the food industry generally, and I don't discuss at length in the book. I'm not going to today. Chemical and microbiological. So if we look at oxidation, there's a tricky one. Oxidation can be chemical oxidation or it can be enzymatic oxidation. which is microbiological. On the other hand, some things are very strictly down to the microbiota in wines. And then, of course, we move from the level of what is clearly a fault to what is a flaw. And some of these, of course, can be just poor wines, you know, or problems in the vineyard, pouty mildew, downy mildew, etc. Careless winemaking, or they've been a bit heavier than bentonite, taking out a lot of aroma and flavour. But to my mind as well, some of the fault compounds at low levels can say, yes, this wine is flawed. It's just got that dash of Brett, for example, which is perhaps taken away a little bit, or maybe not, but is detracting. Right. Just on the slide there, that was Brett yeast, by the way, this wonderful episode of yeast. Can faulty wines be excellent? Yes. And I thought I'd give an example of the winemaker or a winemaker who's loved and hated in equal proportions, Nicolas Joly from the Loire. And pretty much every oenologist thinks that every wine that Joly's ever made is faulty. And many Loire lovers, of course, think they're absolutely superb. So I thought we have a tasting note there from Claude Le Bergerie. And we've chosen many other people, Lisa Perotti Brown, and, you know, ethyl acetate fault, acidoaldehyde fault, high volatile acidity fault, beautiful, rich, mature fruit, and the wine tastes delicious. You know, so a wine that is paradoxically excellent. And I must say, I would rather have some of these wines, which may be faulty, clearly faulty from time to time, other times are excellent, than all these wines that are technically perfect, but so dull and other, you know, and really uninteresting. Let's look at how we can identify just a few of the faults and a few of the ones we get on the appearance, and I'm sure most of you will know most of these. Come down to the third one, though. Unexpected light colour can be a sign of atypical aging. Once again, the unexpected bubbles, fermentation in bottle. How the wide world has changed. Talk about fashion. Who's into pet nats? You know, sort of wines that would have definitely been regarded as faulty a few years ago. They're sparkling wines undergoing their continuous or secondary fermentation in bottle, and as cloudy as anything, you know, but now that is a new style. Hazes, presence of use of bacteria, unstable proteins. And it can be argued that a haze is not a clear fault, because very often it doesn't impact really on the aroma or flavour, can just impact on texture a little bit. And one to look out for cloudy appearance with brown tinges, talking of red wine, is very much a sign of heat damage. Sorry if this slide is a little bit small, but I wanted to get them all on one slide. And if you haven't got time to look at them all today, this session is being videoed, so you can review that, or preferably still buy the book. Just looking down at some of these, I think you probably know most of them. The nail varnish solvent from ethyl acetate is an interesting one, because that is a matter of level again. Atypical aging, once again, that wet dishcloth and mothballs I mentioned. Vomit is an interesting one, because it can come from Brettanomyces, but also from lactic acid associated faults, particularly in excess of diacetyl. The smoke taint, we are finding more and more. People are trying to blend this out, in my opinion. But any wine that smells of smoky bacon crisps, you might suspect smoke taint, jamminess from heat damage, but sometimes that's winemaking techniques. And one fault I don't discuss today, that very earthy geosmin nose. Geosmin actually means taste of the earth, a beetroot type nose. And looking at some tasting characteristics, the trigeminal indicators, those are the tactile indicators, by the way, and I'm sure you're mostly familiar with these. Once again, the thin body, the metallic, non-tannic bitter finish from atypical aging, one you might not know. And going to the second to the last one there, peanut, unexpected bell pepper. Obviously, you get bell pepper sometimes, particularly from Sauvignon Blanc and white and Carmenere in reds, but can be from ladybug or brown marmorated stink bug, which I will cover very briefly later. And another one from heat damage, prunes, and overcooked or soaked fruit cake. So let's just have a glance at some of the key ones of these, and we'll start with Chloroanasols. You'll see that there are 11 of these known to taint wine, and we normally refer to them as cork taint. There are 4 main ones, I list there. PCA isn't that important in so much as the threshold, threshold is so high that you rarely find it above threshold in wine. TCA is the most important, and you see it counts for over 80%. TBA, tribromoanisole, probably counts for 17 or 8% of tainted wines. And TBA never comes from cork. It's another source of contaminant, particularly aerial contaminant, cellars, etc. Sensory detection thresholds are minute. And for TCA, the still wine, somewhere between 1.4 and 3 nanograms a litre, and in sparkling wine, maybe a tenth of that. And I've given some analogies there. A nanogram a litre parts per trillion, so 1 nanogram a litre would be 1 grain of wheat in 100,000 tonnes. Or to look at another way, a single second out of 32,000 years. And to a visual aspect there, 1 sugar cube in 60 Olympic swimming pools would be the level at which you can tell TCA taint in a still wine, and maybe in 600 swimming pools in sparkling wine. It's often been said a few tablespoons full of this horrendous compound is enough to affect every wine in the world. Doesn't just affect wine. Beer, pre-packaged vegetables, particularly ready-to-eat salads and carrots, water, including tap water, pharmaceuticals, being a number of examples of drugs getting recalled. You'll see the Pfizer one there, Lipitor, been recalled a number of times, flour, rice, sultanas, all sorts of things. A good example of tap water, I remember an Australian tasting, the Western Australian taste in London year before last. I was at Larry Cherubino's stand and I just picked up a new glass and poured the wine. Said, Larry, this wine is tainted and it is TCA. So gave me his glass, said, no, it's not, same bottle. And of course the glass had been washed in local London tap water. It's a particular problem in Beijing with tap water, and it can give a big problem in wineries where tap water is used for all sorts of things, including rehydrating additives and processing aids, and also, of course, just for basic cleaning. We'll see that TCA can be formed wherever we have a material containing cellulose, such as cork or wood. I kind of come back to wood, and let's do it now. The growing problem with TCA in barrels, including new barrels from some coopers I will not name because I cannot afford to get sued. So you need material containing cellulose, you need mold, particularly filamentous fungi, which metabolizes the compound, and then for TCA 2,4,6-trichlorophenol, which often present in water once again, and certainly present in chlorine-based bleachers, which used to be extensively used, and thank God no longer are, and often used to be used in cork production, both in the boiling of corks and also bleaching of the finished cork. So tribromoanisole be formed from tribromophenol, so the other haloanisole other than TCA are formed a similar way. So the precursors of bromophenols or chlorophenols. Chlorophenols did not exist prior to prior to the 1930s, we'll say. They are environmental pollutants introduced into the environment by the activities of the chemical, petroleum and tutorial and pharmaceutical industries. And they are now absolutely everywhere. They are airborne. They are a huge pollutant, a big problem. Bromophenols did exist before World War II because they are naturally formed. Now, if you read old books on cork taint, it's very seldom mentioned. George Saintsbury does in his note from the cellar book in 1924, books of cork wine. But you see lots of evidence from going to post-World War II to the 1960s of sommeliers at top restaurants saying that if they had corked wines, they were always post-World War II wines if you had wines from the 1920s or early 30s, they might have had a crumbly cork or something, but wouldn't have the musty cork associated aroma. So the TCA became a huge problem post World War II. We all know how to identify the typical odor characteristics there. One that not everyone knows is the wet concrete, which if you get a compound at sort of fairly low level, before you get the mustiness, wet concrete might be evident. But say at low levels, you would not get any of the musty aromas, but the fruit will be masked and muted, etc. And the complexity withdrawn on the wine will taste very, very flat. Much less of a problem than it used to be. We see these figures from the Quality Council of USA of the decline since the height, which certainly was at the end of the 1990s and early 2000s. Having said that, there are still more than we would wish corked wines, and I will use the word corked, i.e. resulting from cork. And in fact, at the Roussillon wine, a tasting I was a couple of days ago, had 2 wines that clearly the problem was result of cork, whereas the second bottle was absolutely fine. Lots of steps taken in the wineries, or should be taken, to avoid problems. Some of these are pretty obvious. Important thing is air renewal, because the halanosols will concentrate in areas where there's low air renewal. Must prohibit all PCP and TBP compounds. There were huge problems in the 1990s and early 2000s in Bordeaux, and in the 2000s also in South America and USA, the cellars being contaminated. And these are well documented, so I won't get sued. Chateau du Courbecaille, Chateau de Tours, Chateau Canon, Montelena, Hansel, Erasowitz, etc., etc., had huge problems. These are much less the case today. Having said that, without naming it for obvious reasons, I know at least one class growth Bordeaux that definitely has a haloanisole cellar problem today. That hasn't entirely gone away. So periodic testing of all the areas and screening your corks and the jars there, the corks getting soaked so they then get analysed to see if a batch of corks is tainted. Haloanisole tainted wines can be treated, but most of these are illegal, not recognised by the OIV. And in bulk, you can find the wine with half milk, half cream, filter through zeolites. The stones you see in the hand there are zeolites. Use polythene resin beads, absorption by yeast hulls. And one that you can try at home is polyvinylidene chloride, PVDC, or even PVC. You get a wine you think is cork, get some cling wrap or whatever it's called in your market, stuff it in the glass, and it will absorb some of the haloanisole taint. Problem is, by the time it's absorbed it all, it will take about 3 days, and the wine would be so horrendously oxidized, it would be undrinkable anyway. So perhaps something for a party trick, if nothing else. There is another major source of musky taints in wine, which isn't haloanisole, that is the MGMP, and you'll see lots of the sensory characteristics are isomorphic with haloanisole. Green hazelnut is an interesting one, extremely potent. You see once again a desperately low detection threshold there. Only being recognised in 2004. In fact, interesting enough, TBA was only recognised by Pascal Chateauneuf in 2004. So lots of wines that were previously put down as cork taint may well have been as a result of TBA cellar taint. Often co-occurs, particularly with TCA, in cork as well, and both can be absorbed by wine in bottle. Interesting enough, if you get a cellar taint, cork in fact can sometimes actually take it out of the wine. And if you get a wine that you think is a problem due to cork, one good idea is to sniff the cork at both ends. And if the end next to the wine smells a lot of musty aromas, the cork may well have been absorbing it from the wine. Not definitely. Right, I'm just going to have a sip of water while we start looking at our good old friend Brettanomyces. So, a yeast genus, and the presence of the compounds metabolized by Brett may be a serious fault, or could even sometimes be desirable depending on the matrix of the wine and the taster. Compounds, I say, can affect the quality of wine, but here's a problem now, that if they're not present, Brett removal is a problem, because the steps taken, particularly sterile filtration down through 0.45 or sometimes even 0.2 microgram filter medium, is definitely detracting from quality. Now, once again, the right wine or the wrong wine in the right or wrong place or the wrong time. Some wineries built their reputation on Brett. Chateau Musard, I mean, the wines had high Brett and very high VA. Historically, much less so today. If I had to just bought for Waitrose, some of the branches still got some 2001 in stock, which I actually bought as good illustration of Brett and high VA in a wine. Many your own producers, of course, Beaucastel, for a classic example, historically the wine showed very high levels of Brett, which the producers would put down to two things, one of which was terroir, and the other of which was particularly if they're using a bit of a slug and mouvage in the wine, which can give some Brett-like characteristics. The name comes from British fungus. It was first identified by Clausen at the New Carlsberg Brewery back in 1904. And here's a problem talking about wine scientifically. In the scientific world, we shouldn't use the term Brettanomyces, we should use Deca, because only spore-forming forms of these are really allowed a scientific description as the teleomorphs, while Brett is a non-spore-forming aneomorph. 4 compounds are metabolized: 4EP, 4EG, isovaleric acid, and 4EC. And say wines impacted by Brett often show very high VA as well. And I got on this slide some of the odor characteristics of these particular compounds. Band-Aid is quite a common one from 4EP. The overt spiciness and cooked bacon from 4EG. The isovaleric acid with sweaty salads and vomit even. And 4EC gives a cheesy, more stable, more the horse nose. Presence normally the compounds normally co-occur in different ratios. In beer, many craft brewers love it. The factory brewers hate it, but the craft brewers can love it. A number of USA craft brewers, and I've got a lot of time for USA craft brewers. A lot of these guys started out as home brewers and slowly went into craft beers. But many of the Belgian, the Lambic beers, and got the Rodenbach Grand Cru, which is a Brett primary and secondary fermented beer. And you'll see a nice little quote from Book on Yeast by Chris White and Zona Chef, saying the spices of an Indian grocer to your local supermarket beer is both complex and delicious. Must be said in beer, the 4EG is normally the most prevalent compound. There are some winemakers who are embracing Brett, and I thought I'd show Marisi and Mandy Helt Donovan here, who's making, sounds crazy, a white Beaujolais Nouveau style wine. That sounds really weird. And she sees it, the humble story of the yeast trying to make good. And it must be said, there are many non-Saccharomyces yeasts other than Brett, which are now getting embraced by a number of winemakers, particularly for their value in not fermenting such high alcohol levels. And of course, we're all cursing also these 14.5 and 15% alcohol wines, and by using some non-Saccharomyces yeast can help get something with better balance. A lot on this slide, but we'll see that Brett comes from hydrocinamic acid precursors, which initially forms into vinyl phenols and then into the ethyl phenols, which is what usually give the aromas, odors, and flavors that we don't want. Want to look at that in more detail, watch the video, or preferably still buy the book. There are ways of, if you're a winemaker, trying to reduce your risk of Brett, including work in the vineyard, you'll see, and not harvesting too late. Regular rackings, because Brett concentrates in the lees, and filtration. You see the cells are usually between 2 and 7 microns in size, so filters less than that, depending on the strain in question, should get rid of it. But particularly in here is a challenge now: maintain appropriate level of molecular sulfur dioxide in your wine. Now, many of us writers and also the winemakers are normally talking about free sulfur dioxide. The free sulfur dioxide, the sulfates, are great for controlling oxidation, but it's only the molecular SO2 that works in an antimicrobial way. And the amount that is available as molecular is very much dependent on pH, and the higher pH, only a small fraction is available as molecular SO2. So to my mind, red wine makers are well advised to keep their pHs below about 4.6, 4.7 at the most. Must say you can get Brett in white wines as well, very unusual, and also in sparkling wines. Can be treated. Firstly, you need to get rid of the cells by filtration or other treatments. We'll see you there. But that one, get rid of the off odors. You need to get rid of those by reverse osmosis, yeast hulls, and activated charcoal, all of which are now permitted by the OID and EU. But activated charcoal will take many desirable aromas and flavors out as well. So perhaps that one isn't desirable, and there is dispute on reverse osmosis. Oxidation, we all know only too well, and there are three types, two most important: enzymatic, which only affects must pre-fermentation. For it to take place, you need copper-containing enzymes, polyphenol oxidase, or tyrosinase, which some people think is the same thing, or lacase, which you often get in botrytis-affected grapes. If you've got a good level of glutathione in your grapes, that will limit the enzymatic oxidation, as of course does sulfur dioxide. More prevalent is the chemical oxidation, which affects wines where the phenols are reacting indirectly with oxygen, a very long process. Needs either iron or copper in the wine for this to take place, by far the most usual form of oxidation. And then there is a third form, which is not so often found, of microbial. These are some of the compounds present in oxidized wines and with their characteristics, which may be desirable. You know, the bruised apple on a Fino sherry, or nuttiness on a Amontillado may well be desirable, and some of the others can be desirable. Looking down there at Sutherland, the walnuts from a good sweeter style Madeira, Bohème or Malmsey, you know, certainly something that they're looking for at an appropriate level. Premox is still with us, obviously a big problem in white Burgundies in the early years of this millennium, somewhat less so now in Burgundies, but certainly is manifesting itself in other white wines and also in red wines. Number of reasons are being put forward, which you'll see there, including clonal selection and a lack of glutathione. The way people are gas flushing their presses, and in other words, the wine doesn't have any oxidation at all at pressing time, and suddenly at various stages it becomes exposed to oxygen, particularly during cellar operations. Too much use of batonnage on white wines. Batonnage is by definition that the process is oxidative, although of course the leaves are actually antioxidants, as it were, in the wine. But actually while you're stirring, you've got to be careful you don't get too much oxygen in. Ingress of oxygen at bottling time for careless bottling is still a problem, and low quality closures of all types. So Premox is still very much with us, and I'm still finding quite a few white wines, Bordeaux especially, more and more. Volatile sulfur compounds, I think we all know these and the way they came to the fore, particularly since the advent of screw cap closures and so-called post-bottling reduction. Hydrogen sulfide, always undesirable, that bad egg, drainy smell. But methane thiol, ethane thiol, and dimethyl sulfide do manifest themselves. They can go away with time. The desirable forms are often called mercaptans in the wine industry, and once they become, the desirable forms are often called thiols, and once they become undesirable, called mercaptans. This is a whole book in itself, it must be said, but it brings me on to the light strike, which to my mind is a problem very much on the increase. found in white and rosé wines exposed to UV light, very much on supermarkets shelves, sorry to say, will depend on obviously the duration, the intensity of the light, etc. Research has shown that bottles can be affected after minutes, let alone hours, days, weeks or months. And you'll see there some classic examples. The supermarket in France, photographs were taken just before I left France in April. In fact, there's some sauterne there. The rear set bottle on the left, well and truly light struck. These were adjacent bottles on the shelf, must be said. And the other sauterne there, even more so. And obviously one had gone onto the shelf later than the other. Show all the signs of the contents of the glass. More and more champagne producers are now bottling in brown glass because that filters out most of the damaging UV light. And I wish more wine producers would move to brown rather than green glass as well. Big problem, of course, in whites and clear bottles and rosés, which the marketing people love. Right, very quickly, because we're fast running out of time, some of the newer faults sort of manifest themselves. The ladybird, lady beetle, ladybug, whatever you want to call it, which there are two types, the seventh spot on the top there, and the multicolored Asian lady beetle. Here's an interesting one, first introduced as a biocontrol thing in the United States in the 1990s, and the first problems in wines came just a few years later in 2001 with the peanut aromas. Just a few of these in a cluster, if they get through sorting, etc., can taint wine. And the one illustration at the bottom there is a brown marmorated stink bug. There are many stink bugs or shieldbud bugs, but the BMSB is one that is causing problems. And a few of those in the bunch can give this overt coriander or almond-like aroma or odor. These are still very small, not very often found nowadays, but they're very much on the increase in Europe. Unwanted fermentation in bottle is increasing and not decreasing, largely once again because the trend to have more residual sugar in wines, and obviously it affects pretty much every aspect of wine, including texture. Normally when the wine is being contaminated at the last minute before bottling, might have gone through sterile filtration, but still there's a contaminant, maybe even in the cork or the cork or jaws, etc. A few yeast cells get through, and how you pressed over, they've either got a malolactic or the bacteria get through, or alcoholic fermentation in bottle. So you see some of the prevention steps, and once again, appropriate molecular sulfur dioxide to inhibit bacteria so you don't get an MLF in bottle. Potassium sorbate on the bottom of the slide is very controversial because that gives problems in its own right. Right, I'm supposed to do 40 to 45 minutes, we've done about 50, 55. So for all the rest of the info, please buy the book. Having had 16 months in lockdown, I need a dosh apart from anything else. And it has all the info in there. As a reviewer, as just kindly said, you can regard the book as an investment. And if you buy direct from the publisher and quote the LFS2 code, you get a 20% discount. There are other discounts available through Amazon or Hive, etc. Thank you so much. I haven't been looking at the chat, I'm going to say straight away. So I hope, Meg, you've been seeing what questions there are.
Yes, I have. Thank you so much, Keith. That was fascinating. I was typing as fast as I could. There have been a number of questions. The first from, I'm not familiar with this member, but Yegas from South Africa had a question about pinking in white wine. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yes, good afternoon from South Africa. There was an instance, there was an instance once with Klein Constantia, who did a beautiful Sauvignon Blanc, and it was bottled, and when it was subsequently opened, it was sold on the retail shelf, and when opened, it presented with pinking. It did not affect the taste of the wine, the aromas, it was just pink when it should have been white. Thank you.
Okay, yes, pinking is a growing problem. As you say, the great thing about it is that it doesn't really detract from taste. And in fact, I'm just referring to the page in my book, in fact, well, once again here. Yeah, can normally avoid it, in fact, by appropriate filtration. And I was trying to check on what you normally need. In fact, and anything that's regarded as anywhere near sterile. It is obviously an oxygen problem once again, and does affect certain white grape varieties. It is a growing problem. To be honest, as it doesn't affect the aroma, doesn't affect the taste, it doesn't worry me that much. Particular problem with Pinot Grigio, in fact, that seems to be the most prevalent variety for pinking.
Great, thank you. And Paul White had a question about excess copper sulfate, excuse me. Paul, would you like to elaborate your question?
Let's see if I'm off here, or rather off unmute. Yeah, previously actually on the pinking thing, when I was in South Africa 6-7 years ago, they were telling me that they saw a lot of the pinking happen under screw caps, and they were considering it was actually had some relationship to the use of copper sulfate they were adding.
It does. Yeah, sorry to interrupt. It does. I didn't talk about this when looking at reduced aromas, particularly in Australia, but elsewhere. When screw caps first came in, the wines were first showing volatile sulfur compounds. Copper was always regarded as the answer. Copper sulfate, pentahydrate, copper citrate, etc. It has now been shown, in fact, that, to be honest, copper is, I'm not going to say a waste of time, but of limited use. And certainly any improvement is a very short-term effect. Personally, I am adverse to use of copper at any stage in wine. I'm adverse to its use in vineyards, and of course even organic producers are using copper in vineyards, and copper isn't naturally present in soils, etc. So you're probably not going to get an objective view for me on the use of copper. But yes, you are right regarding use of copper sulfate in pinking.
Yeah, I had similar experience when I was in New Zealand writing in the early 2000s, and getting massive amounts of wines that were under screw cap, and they were just completely flat, especially between 202 and 204, or 2002 and 2004. And even then, a friend of mine who had a PhD in chemistry was telling everybody you cannot defeat reduction, sulfide reduction, using copper sulfate. It's going to at some point.
No, I say it's still a very controversial topic, but even the AWRI are starting to question too much use of copper sulfate and copper citrate.
Thank you, Paul. Per, you had a question. Oh, I'm sorry, Paul. Did you want to follow up?
Well, I have another question on Brettanomyces, but I can wait on that. So
yeah,
why don't you go forward? It's okay, and we're at the hour, but I think if people are curious and want to stay,
I've got no problem staying another 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Keith.
Okay,
Paul,
I've been judging wine since 1987 every year, and one of the things I find, especially with Brettanomyces, is there's so many different aromatic characters. It's quite easy to miss it just sniffing it, and it can be a complexing agent in some respects. But where I really can detect it is on the palate, and oftentimes it just feels like somebody scraped my tongue with a piece of sandpaper.
Yeah.
And one of these things about describing faults is I find a lot of cases nobody really talks about the impact on the palate, the length of the wine, or the kind of how it blends in or doesn't blend in with tannins and acidity and things.
Back to my wine matrix. Sorry, just before we leave pinking, actually, I did mean to say, of course, I say it's oxygen, but reduction as well. If you make the wine under reductive conditions and then expose it to oxygen suddenly, so back to your screw cap there, Paul, you open the bottle and it's suddenly got the oxygen all at once, having been in a reductive environment, and that certainly brings it to the fore. But with Brett, I mean, the Brett I find absolutely fascinating. And I make wine in North Cyprus, which is the unofficial part of Cyprus. And my principal, Mustafa, is absolutely adverse to Brett at all costs. And when I was last there, we're going through the barrels, and hey presto, with one barrel, you know, there was so much leather and horse sweat you would not believe, you know. So, and then a big dilemma: we were going to destroy the wine. You know, a small winery throwing away 225 litres of wine is not an easy decision. You know, it's a few grand down the drain straight away. Then, of course, we've got to burn the barrel. And I just say him, I said, well, I can treat this for you. He says, I don't want this wine going through any piece of equipment in my winery, full stop, you know. But, you know, I mean, on some wines I was tasting not that long ago, Level Poiferre 2005, had just a nice touch there of the 4EC, which gives the leather notes. And I think that turned that into a wine of the soul rather than a wine of the head or the heart even. It just added that extra dimension. But what will come in the future, I'm quite sure, is the ability to control the various strains in winemaking. That is in the future at the moment.
The other question I would have related to that is, my experience has been that oftentimes Brett declines markedly and seems to marry into the wine after about 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, very much so. And in fact, you know, I suppose one of the problems now, people are more used to drinking young wines. And I think there's another problem as well, actually, for those, I'm not sure I'm the oldest person here. When I was a kid, I used to go to the country, and it wasn't just a visual experience, it was a sensory experience from, you know, all those aromas of the countryside, and even the city streets, you know, the smell of animals, you know, dog crap and all sorts. And of course, in many ways, we're in a cleaner world now, and people don't age the wines as much as well. And people expect, you know, their great burgundies, you know, to be drinking at 4 years old, etc., before they've really got too many tertiary characteristics. So people are expecting cleaner primary and secondary fruit wines, and you know, in an aged wine, well, put it down as part of the tertiary characteristics. A little bit of Brett can be quite nice in the right wine, in the right place.
Thank you. Per, that's actually a good segue to Per, your question you wanted to
yes.
unpack.
Yes, I was curious about the atypical aging. If you could expand a bit on what is the cause of that, and also how you identify it.
Right, let me come right up to the slides in question, which will probably make it just a little bit easier for me. I can do, excuse me while I flick through a few slides. Right. Do we have a screen share at the moment, or do we not?
That's fine.
Yes,
I'll bring it up to the full slide there, actually. So the main compound responsible, you'll see there as 2-AAP. And the thing is, if this is present in wine, it doesn't matter what level, what concentration it is the mere presence of this compound that will lead to atypical aging. So whether it's 10 times as much or obviously 10 as much, makes no difference at all. So it starts in the vineyard, and particularly from hydric stress, normally evident with high yields, and particularly if you try and get high yields in dry years. And you see this is one of the reasons why Germany, particularly Germany, used to, as we all know, be responsible for all those sugar water wines, you know, the Bereich Bernkastel, Piensport, Mikkelsberg, you know, near Steiner-Gutes, Domtal, where they're having massive yields of 180 hectolitres a hectare. And this really started manifesting itself. But then it only appears after the first sulfurization, which of course is normally following the MLF, because most people, if they're putting for an MLF, want to do so before they increase the sulfur levels. And the only way you can prevent it happening is through the use of ascorbic acid immediately at that point. If it's manifested itself on the nose, then you're too late. Ascorbic acid will make no difference whatsoever. But I say on the subsequent slides, you saw some of there how you can get it on the appearance by the very, very pale colour, and particularly on the nose if a wine starts smelling too waxy. And don't confuse that with honey, but actually sort of the furniture wax and mothballs. It could be, as I repeat, it could be a victim of atypical aging.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Jochen, you had a question, you had your hand raised. Would you like to say something?
I just returned from a competitive tasting in Italy, and we had fortified wine from Sardinia, and I was the only judge in the group who considered over alcoholized wine as faulty. it was 19% alcohol, but the alcohol was not integrated at all. It was wine as if you would just put it together with pure alcohol, and it was not integrated at all. And for me, a wine where the high alcohol is not integrated is faulty. You spoke about excess reduction, excess sulfur. How is it with excess alcohol?
Well, here we come to the boundaries between what is faulty, what is flawed, and what is acceptable.
Correct.
And
Yes.
this does come down to culture once again. You know, to many USA people, Californians, a Chardonnay with 16% alcohol very often can be very pleasant, and maybe not so to many Europeans. It is that boundary. I would agree that on a so-called table wine with that level of alcohol would certainly take it into the realms of faulty. But flawed, I say to my mind, does come down to poor balance, the interplay with tannin, acidity, fruit, alcohol, you name it, all the components of wine. I've got to say I'm a wine drinker in so much as I like to drink a glass or even half a bottle of wine. And to my mind, anything that is too much alcohol, I'm just sipping away, and that is not a wine lover's drinker's wine to me from my European viewpoint. But congratulations, by the way, of A, getting into Italy, and B, getting back into Britain. Now you can put that down on your CV. I think that's a great achievement.
You would consider it as bad quality, not as a fault.
As it's not caused by a fault compound, then I probably wouldn't consider it a fault, but I certainly consider it flawed. Okay, but
thank you.
Hard to form the boundaries.
Well, thank you all. This was fantastic, Keith. I learned so much, and now I have even more to study, obviously, and I'm sure everyone feels the same. If there are no more questions, I didn't see any in the chat. I'd just like to say thank you once again. And thank you, Liz, for your introduction. And I hope to see you all the next one. As we mentioned, I put it in the top of the chat if you'd like to see it. But it's let's talk about Chianti Gran Selezione with Giovanni Manetti, Friday, 16 July at 2 p.m. So hope to see you all there. Thank you so much.